Hi all, welcome back. I hope you all had a good lunch. I think most of you who I see on the screen were with us this morning, but in case anyone is just joining us now, let me just reintroduce myself. My name is Jenny McComas. I'm the curator of European and American art here at the Eskenazi Museum of Art at Indiana University. We're entering our the second half of today's symposium on modernist murals. Again, this is held in conjunction with the Eskenazi Museum's exhibition, Swing Landscape, Stuart Davis, and the Modernist Mural. So we had two talks this morning that placed Stuart Davis's mural Swing Landscape a bit into the broader context of mural painting in the 1930s and 40s. This afternoon, we'll be hearing from two scholars whose work on Stuart Davis himself has been pioneering. And following those talks, please stay with us for a panel discussion featuring all of our speakers. And we will have 15-minute breaks between each of these segments of the program, so you can get away from your screen for a little bit. Before introducing our next speaker, I just want to quickly review a couple of the housekeeping issues for our Zoom meeting. Again, in case you weren't with us this morning, you may notice that you're not going to be able to unmute yourselves, but if you have a question during the Q&A, we can unmute you individually at that time. We've also disabled the chat, except you will be able to send messages to myself or to Marluce Krabbe, who's our graduate curatorial assistant, and she's helping with some of the technical issues today. So let's turn now to our third speaker in this program, Jody Patterson. So Dr. Jody Patterson is the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation Chair of Art History at The Ohio State University. Her research has focused on the relations between modernism, public art, and politics in the United States. Jody contributed an essay to the exhibition catalog for the Swing Landscape Show. Thank you so much, Jody. And actually, Marluce, if you wouldn't mind putting that link in the chat to the catalog once more, that would be wonderful. Most recently, Jody is the author of Modernism for the Masses, Painters, Politics, and Public Murals in New Deal, New York. And she is currently at work on her second book, tentatively titled, What About Modern Art and Democracy? American Art in the 1940s. And so I'll turn it over now to Jody for her talk, which is entitled, All That Jazz, Stuart Davis and the Modern Art of Swing. And Jody, I may need to just briefly make you a co-host so you can screen share.
There we go. Thank you so much, Jenny. And I'd just like to take a brief moment to offer some acknowledgements and some thanks. So firstly to Jenny for bringing together just a stupendous exhibition in terms of the mural studies and all of the labor that went into bringing this together. So many thanks for that. And then also for this symposium, which it's just a joy to be part of. And there are multiple reasons for that. But firstly, I get to thank with that person right here, Greta Berman, whose truly groundbreaking work some decades ago very much set the stage for all the scholarship that followed. And I would also mention, though I don't think she's here today, Nancy Troy. We all stand on the shoulders of giants. So it is a real pleasure to be sharing space in this symposium with you, Greta. And I've also been duly impressed to see amongst the audience members, people who have been so important to the formation of my own work. And if I could just say a quick thanks, Karen Wilkin and Helen Harrison, Erica Doss, Wanda Korn, and a special shout out, if you will, to Francine Tyler, who's again, just amazing work on the Artists Union was so pivotal to my own. Okay, so I'm going to return very specifically to Swing Landscape. I'll share my screen here. Okay, and there it is, and the mural at the center of all of this. So art and music have long engaged in cultural dialogue and exchange. During the early decades of the 20th century, the new rhythms of jazz played a significant role in the development of modern art in the United States. For Stuart Davis, jazz was an abiding interest, and the mural at the center of the Eskenazi exhibition stands as a testament to the ways in which he took inspiration from this quintessentially American cultural art form. And you might wish to think of my contribution here as a kind of part one. So I would like to share something by way of an historical overview of jazz and the cultural ideals with which it was associated during the period in which Davis created swing landscape. And my intention is to sort of lay out a bit of history for Harry Cooper, who's going to follow. And unless he's changed his mind, I think he's going to offer a more detailed, more nuanced, formal, and stylistic analysis of the mural. Though the precise origins of jazz remain uncertain, it evolved in the South during the late 19th, early 20th centuries. It was a distinctive fusion of African and European music and found its roots in slave songs, spirituals, ragtime, and blues. The mainstream flourishing of jazz by the 1920s, a decade suitably known as the Jazz Age, was tied to the Harlem Renaissance, a cultural, social, and artistic explosion that took place between the First and Second World Wars. This was the period of the Great Migration, when thousands of African Americans moved from the rural South to the urban North. Harlem emerged as a vital cultural center, drawing African American writers, artists, musicians, poets, and scholars into the new Negro movement, a cultural crucible named after the writings of philosopher Alan Locke and very much inspired by Marcus Garvey, an early civil rights activist and proponent of the Black nationalism and Pan-African movements. And what we're looking at here on the left is a painting by African American painter Palmer Hayden. During the late 1930s, and again, I'm trying to focus my artworks right at the exact time that Davis was working. During the late 1930s, Hayden developed a consciously naive style to depict various aspects of African American life. And here we have A Midsummer Night in Harlem from 1938, which is one of the first paintings to announce Hayden's adoption of this new style. The flat forms and stylized figures effectively evoke the mood of Harlem's residents congregating outside on the stoops to escape the heat from inside their tenements. And then next to that, we have a cover of Alan Locke's incredibly important volume that he edited, The New Negro. Archibald Motley was another of the great chroniclers of contemporary African-American life who came to prominence during the Harlem Renaissance. Caught up in the cultural ferment of the Jazz Age, though working in Chicago, and I would add that Motley was actually one of the first Black students to be admitted to the Art Institute of Chicago. His paintings use vivid colors and dizzying spatial distortion to depict revelers of diverse racial backgrounds enjoying their leisure time on a night out. Motley confirmed that jazz provided a much needed model of liberty and creative expression for modern artists in the US who were searching for ways to subvert established definitions of art, namely those associated with the dominance of academic painting. Philip Evergood was also a fan of jazz, and indeed he had trained both as an artist and a musician, in fact, a pianist early on, and in his teaching, he taught art and painting together up until about 1943. Evergood was amongst those artists, Black and white, who engaged jazz for its ability to make a virtue of dissonance, or put differently, to allow a new harmony to emerge from difference. Evergood's monumental oil on canvas, simply entitled Music, measures some 5.5 by 10 feet. Like Swing Landscape, and this is a subject we've returned to a couple of times today, it is one of those liminal works of the period that was intended as a mural, but is now often treated as a large easel painting. The composition is rendered in a cacophony of bright, unsaturated colors, and at first glance appears chaotic. The viewer is faced with a group of 35 musicians playing percussion, brass, woodwind, and strings. The variety of distinct physiognomies in this informal orchestra unites humanity, different ages, genders, races, and social classes. The mural was painted for the Pierre de Guider Club in New York, a union of left-wing composers and intellectuals. With its deliberately disjunctive style, the painting is akin to the anthems and folk ballads created by Evergood's fellow de Guider Club members, thereby blending art and ideology in a social realist idiom that was intended to make both an artistic and a political statement. African-American artist Aaron Douglas was especially interested in the political resonances of jazz. In 1934, he painted a series of murals under one of the early New Deal programs. And you see, I've got under the title PWAP. So that's the Public Works of Art program that was a predecessor to the Federal Art Project. The cycle of paintings that he did for the PWA entitled Aspects of Negro Life. The cycle, which is in situ at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem, culminates with the panel evoking the Great Migration. And we're looking at that final panel here called Song of the Towers. Here we recognize a modern city, but despite the journey north, the forces of oppression are still present. A migrant worker with a suitcase entering the composition at the lower right wears ragged trousers and has no shoes. The men at both corners of the mural are pursued by threatening spectral hands that endeavor to hold them back. But dominating the composition is a jazz saxophonist who stands triumphant on the grinding cogs of the metropolis. With eyes and hands raised toward the sky, he raises his saxophone in view of the Statue of Liberty. In his Song of the Towers panel, Douglas paid the ultimate tribute to the jazz musician with his commanding image of an African-American man and his saxophone held high. In many ways, we might think of this figure as the embodiment of the New Negro movement, which championed Black creativity, liberty, and self-expression. Significantly, the murals were installed over the heads of readers in the Harlem Library, and according to Douglas, they had a very specific mission: to celebrate past and present in terms of African-American achievements, to teach African-Americans about their history, and most significantly for today, to help viewers link jazz music with the modern and art with struggle. And we can also see here in the installation view in the Schomburg Center, on the right is the first panel, and that's Negro in an African setting. And again, music is so key to the entire series of panels. So this is 1938, and the same time that Davis was working on and completed Swing Landscape. Jazz also provided a solution for American modernists who were insistently perceived by critics and commentators as merely imitating their European counterparts in their uptake of advanced pictorial strategies. And by that, I'm thinking about abstraction. Then as now, jazz was internationally regarded as one of the first truly American cultural forms. For example, in his abstract paintings of the late 30s, Arthur Dove sought to establish a uniquely American style of abstract art by emulating the music of the swing soloist. He often listened to jazz in his studio and experimented with line, color, and form to reflect the innovative rhythms of the swing musician. In the one we're looking at here, Swing Music, subtitled Louis Armstrong, Dove provides an abstract translation of the music of swing's great Satchmo, who was renowned in the 1930s for his gravel voice singing and virtuosic trumpet playing. Armstrong was then hailed as the king of swing, and Dove gives us a blast of brilliant red in his composition, a color often associated with Armstrong's instrument, referred to as his red hot trumpet. And I'm just showing you a period advertisement for Louis Armstrong and his orchestra. It is well known that by the 1930s, Davis increasingly directed attention to the connections between his paintings and jazz music. He was especially interested in swing, a big band variant that Life magazine described in 1938 as the hottest and best kind of swing. And we see two photographs here, one from 1930 and then later in the 50s. Jazz, this interest, remained inspirational for Davis throughout his career. And I would also note, in terms of Davis playing records, in a well-known episode, he spent an evening with Piet Mondrian after he had moved to New York. And apparently Mondrian was a huge fan of Boogie Woogie. Of course, we know Victory Boogie Woogie and the late paintings that take advantage of that very American art form. Davis compared his introduction to artistic modernism with the experience of listening to jazz in clubs in Newark and Harlem. Like so many American modernists of his generation, his introduction to modernism came from the Armory Show in 1913. And that's why I've selected this ink and crayon work on paper that we see, Barrel House, Jackson's band from that same year. And Davis also contributed a number of drawings, illustrations to the magazine of the Communist Party, The Masses, and this one appeared in a February 1914 issue. As Davis recalled, modern art gave him the same kind of excitement he got from the numerical precision of jazz pianists. In his writing, he cited the hot piano of Earl Father Hines as one of the things that made him want to paint. Hines was one of the most revolutionary jazz piano stylists of the 20th century. And we see Father Hines playing his piano there on the right around 1942. During the 1920s, most jazz pianists were trying to emulate the stride style of James P. Johnson, keeping time with their left hand by striding back and forth between bass notes and chords, while their right hand played more melodic variations. And this is what Davis loved about Hines. Hines was the first major pianist to break up the striding, suspending time during wild breaks that utilized both of his hands in these adventurous flights, while always coming back without missing a beat. As Davis confirmed, Hines' technique was consistently dazzling. And in fact, he named his son Earl after Earl Hines. Other jazz icons, such as Duke Ellington, who merged folk elements of African-American experience with European compositional forms, offered Davis a model for effectively extending modernist traditions. Jazz paralleled Davis's own efforts to transpose modernist style onto American subject matter, and in so doing, to create a new vernacular. In 1941, Davis staged a festival of creative swing music with modern painting to, and I quote, this is Davis, to demonstrate to the followers of both forms of expression the relationship between the two, and to show everyone how both are authentic expressions of contemporary society. 2 years later, in 1943, Davis invited Ellington to perform at the opening of his solo show at the Downtown Gallery in New York, and that's what we're looking at on the right. Davis wanted his guests to see how the irregular geometrical shapes and piebald colors of his compositions echoed the rhythms and tempo of swing. Davis's hot stillscape for 6 colors, 7th Avenue style, which we can see in the photo installed on the gallery wall behind Davis and Ellington, and which I've reproduced to the left of that, captures the heady exuberance and intense sensory experience of both jazz and the modern city. The term stillscape was the artist's own invention. It was a combination of landscape and still life elements he abstracted from earlier paintings. And of course, this is something that he does in Swing Landscape as well. And we also see that his personal quotations are coupled with an eclectic array of lines, shapes, and surface patterns. Hot, according to Davis, described the ebullient mood created by the juxtaposition of the 6 colors: white, yellow, blue, red, orange, and black. The designation 7th Avenue refers to the New York street on which Davis had his studio for some 15 years, just blocks away from a number of the hot jazz clubs in the West Village. In earlier works, such as The Back Room, and again, this is from 1913, so around about the time he was looking at European modernists in the Armory Show, Davis depicted musicians performing, and Another thing I would point out, this is a remarkably early composition that includes racial integration. This is something that you just don't see as early as 1913. But by the 1930s, Davis was no longer interested in picturing jazz. And this is a mural we saw previously. This is amply demonstrated in Davis's 1939 WPA mural for the New York Municipal Broadcasting Company's radio station WNYC. The mural includes stylized versions of a saxophone and clarinet, two instruments particularly associated with swing music, and attests to the ways in which Davis's engagement with jazz is of a more abstract order now. Refusing to engage the more easily legible realist conventions prevalent in the 1930s, Davis is here attempting to give visual form to the invisible processes of sound transmission. According to Davis's working notes for the project, he wanted to show, and here I'm quoting him, a series of formal relations which are identified with musical instruments, radio antenna, ether waves, operators panels, and electrical symbols. These various elements I want to be presented in an imaginative rather than a factual relationship, end of quote. The bright colors and musical notation around the saxophone signify its music, which is then transmitted to the central shape and travels through its wires, lines, and squiggles to be sent off through the white line, ether waves, into the radio on the right. Using an abstract language of signs, symbols, and schematic forms, Davis thus envisions the journey of swing sounds from the studio through the radio. And on the right, just to give you a sense of scale, we have Davis at work on the mural for Studio B, and then an actual radio broadcast that's going out so we can see the mural in situ. And there it is. So just as Davis's WNYC mural did not seek to engage music transmission over the airwaves in a straightforward or mimetic fashion, his WPA mural for the Williamsburg Housing Project similarly abstracts motifs and recombines them in a modernist idiom, just as a jazz musician riffs on a melody to create something new. The processes of formal translation to which Davis subjected his subject matter caused some scholars to initially misinterpret the mural because they could not find anything overtly musical in the painting's iconography. As one critic observed, and I quote, "One can look in vain in this vast packed canvas for anything literally pertaining to music. It's not there." But as we know, this was not the point. With its expressive intervals of vibrant color and seemingly spontaneous arrangements of myriad, often unexpected forms, the mural captures the improvisational aspects of hot jazz, the hot jazz of Armstrong and Hines, which relies upon a virtuoso embroidering of a given rhythm, breaking it down, complicating it, and pushing it to its limits. With its interwoven networks of elisions and abrupt, unexpected transition, the mural takes an established theme, and there are actually a number of themes here, and in this case, very often taken from his Gloucester paintings. And then he performs processes of abstraction, recombination, and accumulation. With its arbitrary repetitions, alterations, and superimpositions of forms, Swing Landscape offers something comparable to Armstrong's variations on a theme, as well as his interpolation of fragments from different tunes into a single performance. Furthermore, as our eyes dart between fractured forms and overlapping planes that create the composition's formal and chromatic pyrotechnics, which certainly Edward Alden Jewell commented upon, the enormous energy characterizing the painting recalls the fast-paced tempo of swing with its constant melodic invention and pulsing forward motion. By the latter half of the 1930s, when Davis was at work on the mural, his interest in swing music had increasingly poignant ideological resonances. He shared with many musicians a commitment to artistic freedom that insisted upon the artist's liberty to transform source material and emphasize the prime importance of innovative formal relations. As Michael Denning has convincingly showed us in his book, The Cultural Front, swing music also had a red tinge during the 1930s. Swing was deeply tied to the political and cultural milieu of the Roosevelt era, symbolizing a major reorientation in American national culture and epitomizing a new model of democratic pluralism that sought to enfranchise racial and ethnic minorities. While African Americans in northern cities had traditionally supported the Republicans, the party of Lincoln and emancipation, rather than the Democrats party of Southerners and white supremacy. By 1936, the majority of African American folks now joined working class whites in backing Roosevelt for a second term, with Gallup polls estimating that 76% of the African American vote now went to FDR. Roosevelt was dependent on those same Southern Dixiecrats to remain in the White House, however, and this is surely one of the reasons why he cannot count passing anti-segregation, anti-lynching legislation amongst his watershed New Deal reforms. However, the First Lady was an outspoken advocate for the rights of African Americans and lobbied for full enfranchisement within American democracy. And I'm showing you this picture from Cafe Society, and I'm not sure if my cursor works. Yes. So this is First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt right here. Here we see Eleanor Roosevelt in 1938 at Cafe Society in Greenwich Village, the first racially integrated cabaret outside of Harlem. The idea for the nightclub originated with the Communist Party's General Secretary, Earl Browder, and it was intended to be a fundraising initiative. The walls, as you can just see in the background on the right, featured a shifting selection of murals satirizing upper-class pretensions by artists such as Adolphe Den, William Gropper, and Antoine Refrigier. And the latter, Refrigier, is one of the artists who was involved with the murals for Lane Technical. The avant-garde venue served as a site where the tradition of the political cabarets of Paris and Berlin were transplanted to the US. And Denning has referred to this as a kind of Weimar on the Hudson. It was at Cafe Society that Billie Holiday, who we see here, first performed Strange Fruit, an explicit song of protest against racism, lynching, and a government that refused to pass anti-lynching laws. So it would seem that the First Lady had taken sides. The year 1938 also witnessed a highly ambitious and controversial concert held in honor of the passing of legendary blues singer Bessie Smith. And we're seeing one of the announcements for that, from spirituals to swing. The concert was intended to spotlight and to celebrate the huge contributions made by African-American music to American culture. The idea behind the event was a documentary history, starting with spirituals and leading up to the big band swing bands. Organizer John Hammond, himself a critic, producer, and promoter, who was also a civil rights activist, had great difficulties securing sponsorship for the event because it involved African-American performers and an integrated audience. The Journal of the American Communist Party, New Masses, and earlier we saw a drawing that Davis had contributed to its earlier manifestation, The Masses, agreed to finance the event. Held at Carnegie Hall, the sold-out house prompted a second concert on Christmas Eve, 1939, with the first event continuing to be heralded by many scholars of both culture and music as, and I quote, the single most important jazz or popular music concert in history. This was jazz's coming out party to the world of respectable music. And before I flip to the next slide, just a trigger warning, and the next slide has a particularly gruesome caricature. American jazz had further political resonances. Within the international context, jazz music, like modern art, was being ridiculed and suppressed under fascism in Germany and Japan as decadent and degenerate. The Nazi government's concerns about degenerate music were part of its larger and better known campaign against degenerate art, which we see an installation view of that show in Munich from 1937, where all of the modern art was gathered up and put on show, with the intention of it being ridiculed. And then a similar thing happening with music, and jazz music was seen as one of the most debased forms of modernist music. In both cases, Hitler and his henchmen attempted to isolate, discredit, discourage, and of course ban the works as harmful to blood and soil racial purity. And so that's what we're seeing as part of this caricature. Henceforth, jazz, especially racially integrated jazz, was pressed into service on the front lines of culture in the US, with swing widely embraced as a symbol of the American way of life, one premised upon democracy, tolerance, and freedom of expression. For communists and fellow travelers, and Davis was amongst the latter, a fellow traveler, benefit dances for new masses, the Workers' School, the Young Communist League, along with fundraisers for the defense of Ethiopia and loyalist Spain, invariably included swing bands, not just for the crowds they would draw, but as exemplars of the democratic ideals being defended. And I'm just showing you announcements here from 38 and 39 that highlight the role of swing in leftist culture. As is evident, the meanings of swing were overdetermined, and it was a cultural form that could signify different things to different constituencies. So while it was taken up on the left during World War II, swing was even appropriated by the US Army as a symbol of the inclusiveness of America. Not everyone was convinced by the progressive potential of jazz. Some cultural critics viewed jazz as just another corrupt American commercial product that had been standardized and sanitized for those who controlled the means of cultural production. And I'm thinking here of Theodor Adorno, one of the left's most outspoken critics of jazz. But this view accords little space for human agency on the part of artists, audiences, and indeed producers and promoters. While certainly not here do I wish to deny that swing was instrumentalized during the 1930s by music promoters and record companies who hoped to revive the depressed popular music industry by creating a product that was entirely marketable and that would be profitable. And you can be thinking this is where Adorno's cultural industry would come into play. More recent thinking on cultural production rejects such passivity, at least on the part of consumers, to instead foreground a more dialectical understanding of culture, including the dynamic ways in which cultural forms can generate multiple meanings at points of production and reception. What's more, jazz was shaped by an African-American tradition of oral performance that relied upon a call and response interaction between performers and audience members. Jazz was thereby grounded in dialogue and exchange. Perhaps Davis hoped for an analogous participatory process on the part of his audience. He sought to achieve the accessibility and popularity of jazz, with individual viewers bringing their own experiences to bear when looking at and making sense of his art. And we have a detail of swing landscape there. I want to end by proposing that we might then understand swing landscape and its nod to jazz as both projective and utopian in its claims. With its chromatic vibrancy, its concatenation of differing motifs, it's all over, and hence one might suggest democratic treatment of form and space. The mural's sophisticated formal vocabulary also pointed beyond the canvas towards cultural fusion and social integration. Not unlike the swing music Davis loved, the mural was intended, as the artist observed, and I quote, as an expression of social forces that was itself a social force. Moreover, and perhaps most importantly, it was meant to bring pleasure to its audience. As Davis asserted, anyone can appreciate modern art just as they appreciate jazz music. Above all else, it's there to be enjoyed. So in a testament to the joie de vivre generated by swing and by the mural as well, we're looking here at a pair of Lindy Hoppers at the Savoy Ballroom in 1939. And of course, swing was all about inspiring you to get up and dance. The Lindy Hop was born in Harlem at the end of the 20s and was incredibly popular during the late 30s and early 40s, when swing was in its golden age and Davis was painting his mural. Sometimes referred to as a street dance due to its improvisational and social nature, the Lindy Hop combines elements of both partnered and solo dancing, fusing the more impromptu movements of African-American dances with the formal 8-count structure of European partner dances. And so again, this fusion is something, this is a space in which Davis was working. And that fusion most clearly illustrated in the Lindy Hop's basic step, which we're seeing here, and that's the swing out. During the 1930s, the growing awareness that swing was a distinctly American music born of diverse histories and experiences, and that its players, Black and white, deserved to be heard by Black and white folks equally, was a part of the excitement of swing. And so I leave you with Davis's American painting, a canvas he reworked several times between 1932 and 1941, which features the lyrics of Duke Ellington's 1931 hit, scrolled along the top right-hand corner. It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jody. What a great ending to your talk. And I just really thank you for reminding us that aesthetics never exists in a vacuum. I think that's such an important thing for us to keep in mind. So as before, I'd like to moderate about 10 minutes of questions for Jody. And if you have a question, please use the hand raise function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It's probably located in the reactions icon for most of you. And we'll start with a question from Greta.
This isn't so much a question as a comment. First of all, bravo, that was just fabulous. I saw things that I've not seen before in your juxtapositions. But what I wanted to point out, since we talked about women artists earlier, and I think I talked about it a little bit before, was Lucien Black's mural that she did at George Washington High School, which was controversial and was taken away by the principal and then put back. And there were two possible reasons for it. One was she shows a chorus of Black, white, Chinese, of sort of world harmony of children singing together. And I think that immediately raised, the left idea, and got people upset. And secondly, she sort of has sneaky little abstract things going on from Cubism underneath it. So I think she should somehow be mentioned.
That's a great point. And up in through the 30s and up until the early 1950s, especially during McCarthy witch hunts and so on, racial integration, especially on the part of white folks, was seen as a kind of screen for leftist politics. And that had already started by the end of the 1930s. And so it did immediately, no pun intended, raise red flags as soon as you saw Blacks and whites intermingling and sharing the same social space. So that's a really interesting point in terms of Block. Thank you, Greta.
Thank you, Jody. Just beautiful. Unless somebody else wants to go, I'm so full of ideas you've just given me. But I saw a whole progression of art. I'm an art historian. That Seurat, with the flatness of something like Parade, with the flat sort of tripartite thing and all of the stuff on top of it, going through, of course, to Guernica, which has been mentioned before, but the idea of swing landscape being a kind of triptych and also having this polyphonic effect. It just became so clear as you showed your slides with the music that has all of those elements in it. It's just, there's so much, it's so rich. Thank you.
Davis was pretty amazing. And I'll just, Emily shared a detail about her first experience. So I was working on a completely different project, and I was still in Montreal at this point, and looking at relations between abstract painters in Quebec and France, and went on a road trip with a friend who was preparing something on Alfred Leslie. And one of the stops was in Bloomington, and we were taken down into storage, you know, what have you, and there was Swing Landscape. And I had never seen anything like it. And then to see the date on it, I was sure that it must be, you know, incorrect. There was no way that that was from the end of the 1930s. And that was my sort of like, started me off on my path. It's just such an arresting work to stand before. And that, you know, the whole idea of swing music and Lindy hopping and the exuberance and the not being able to, you know, stand still. I still feel that looking at swing. My eye has trouble resting in any one place, especially when you're, you know, physically in front of it. Just yeah, an amazing, amazing work.
When was this, Jody, that you saw it here in storage?
Yeah, so that would have been maybe 1999, 2000.
Okay, I was just thinking, when was it in storage? It might have been, you know, in preparation for conservation at that time.
Yeah.
Thinking I wasn't here, but great. Are there other questions for Jody at this time? Well, I'll just comment a little bit, you know, something that I've been thinking about as I've done my own research is how when you Swing Landscape wasn't the original title for this mural. I think he called it Waterfront Forms initially, may have gone through one or two other iterations of that title before he settled on Swing Landscape, which I found kind of fascinating because we know it's a Gloucester landscape. So why does he call it Swing Landscape? Why does he specifically want to bring that musical connotation in? And I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, Jody, but you know, in addition to all of the particular political and social resonances of swing music and his own aesthetic appreciation of the genre, you know, I think about Davis wanting to create a kind of art that he felt was, you know, so American. And as you pointed out, swing is distinctively American. And so to utilize that word in conjunction with landscape, I think he's telling us something like this is an American landscape. It may be Gloucester, but maybe it transcends that in some way. And I think the use of the improvisational feel of the piece and the way he blends together, you know, it's a composite of different actually views of Gloucester. You brought up that something similar with the way swing is constructed, and that's a little bit of a rambling comment, but if you have any other thoughts on that.
I think everything that you've just suggested very much is a great response. So the politics, he was very involved in that. We know that he listened to swing, and it cut against a European bias, the sense that somehow American abstraction was some sort of parochial backwater. Williamsburg is, of course, right on the river. So even though he's borrowing, as he so often did from his own previous works, it is still a waterfront location. So, you know, that earlier title, Waterfront Forms. And all of his titles are words that with play in them, with puns, are quite witty. And so Swing Landscape seems to me another one of those titles that can be unpacked in about a dozen different ways.
Yeah. So I have a question that came to me in the chat just now from David Brenneman, wondering, and I don't know the answer to this, but maybe you do, Jody, or maybe Greta or Harry could jump in. Was Davis aware of the synchromists who also saw an analogy between visual art and music.
Yes. So 100%, yes, there were, he had issues with some of the synchronous politics, but he had a huge appetite for American art, and certainly wrote in his own personal papers about some of the synchronists.
Thank you. One more question from Greta. Okay.
Not really a question, just adding to it. Yes, I think he was, I mean, from Cubism through Futurism through Orphism, he was aware of all those things. As I gave that quote earlier on, here we're all French American, Italian American, and he even said, he didn't say Orphism American, but he said Picasso American, and he was aware of all this. But I also wanted to say that his work looks incredibly different from Orphist's work. It's much more American. The Orphists have a kind of roundness to them. It's different music, very different. As you know, I teach at Juilliard, and I'm very involved in music and teaching music, teaching art to musicians. But I think Orphism, while maybe influential in theory, is a very different look.
Absolutely. Harry.
Hi, one thing I'll just throw in, Jenny, you were asking or talking about, why that title, given the Gloucester theme, but in the mural for Studio B that Jody showed at the very center of it, what looks like a kind of a switching station or something is a Gloucester landscape with rigging and water. So there was something about Gloucester that Davis really liked formally, that connected with the music. And I don't know exactly what, and I might not get to it in my talk, so I'm just throwing it in here now.
Great. That's a really something for us to look at more closely next time we see that mural. Thank you. So at this point, I think we'll break again for about 15 minutes. We'll come back at 2:30, and then we'll be hearing from Harry Cooper at that time. So feel free to take a little break.